Hello, I'm Robert Ellis, and this is Talk 2 on Depolarising Politics, following on from Talk 1, which I recommend you listen to first. This talk is called Activists or Quietists? Integrative Practice in the Context of Politics. So in the first talk, I talked about the middle way and the way in which we need to avoid absolutizations in politics. So although we all have political values of some kind or another, we need to avoid absolute interpretations of those values, and we need to try and develop provisional interpretations of those values. And the reason for that is that it is absolute interpretations that end up being polarized, that end up in intransigent conflict, and it's provisional interpretations of political values that are open to the resolution of conflicts. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk instead is integrative practice. So integrative practice is any kind of activity supporting integration over the long term. So if you can integrate yourself, and if you can integrate the groups that you're part of, then that makes middle way judgments more likely. So whether we can be provisional, whether we can avoid absolutizations, is a matter of practice. It's whether we get into the habit of operating in that way. We can make it much more likely that we will do that by developing what we do in a specific way. So I talk about 3 levels at which integrative practice can take place. Those are desire, meaning, and belief. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those here. There are other videos I've made where you can find out more about them. But very briefly, integration of desire is typified by, say, meditation practice, or by certain embodied kinds of practices like yoga or Tai Chi, for example, which have a short-term effect of pulling you together, of centering you in your body particularly, and making you more aware in an immediate sense, so that you end up feeling more whole at that point, and you're in a better position to actually deal with any conflicts that come up. So integration of desire is an immediate thing. Integration of meaning is about understanding the different ways in which you might think about things. So you can extend the integration of meaning in a more cognitive way, for example, by learning different kinds of language, or by understanding new kinds of disciplines that perhaps you're unfamiliar with. But you can just use your imagination, and the arts have a big effect on expanding our integration of meaning. So if we are able to access areas that we might otherwise not be able to access to make new thoughts possible, integration of meaning is what that's about. And finally, integration of belief is the kind of practice typified by critical thinking, which specifically focuses on it, but also many different kinds of reflective and critical academic study, which may well, in various ways, more or less directly, help you develop critical thinking. So the integration of belief allows you to become more aware of your assumptions and to question them, and indeed to be aware of and question other people's assumptions. And that, again, will enable you to actually engage directly with the justification of your beliefs and be more provisional about those beliefs, so that you're willing to learn from new information and to change them and improve them. So that's the integration of belief, because when your current beliefs are coming into contact with other beliefs, then they can be integrated. They can join into a larger and more adequate whole. So that's a very brief outline, really, of integrative practice. Now, integrative practice is not just an individual matter, and obviously that's something that needs to be stressed in a talk about politics. So it can apply at a socio-political level as well as an individual level. So in this talk, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking first at an individual level and then later on about the group or socio-political level. So there are ways that groups and organisations and even governments can practice integratively. They can try and become more whole. They can try and be more effective and adequate by avoiding absolutisations. So if you do manage this, if you become more integrated, or if some of your judgments become more integrated than they were before, this is not a magic bullet. It's not a guarantee that you'll always get things right. But what it does do is filter out one major kind of reason for getting things wrong. And that is getting stuck in one particular way of thinking, some rigid belief about how things are, attached to the idea that you've got the whole story, which prevents you from actually engaging with new conditions and actually learning when things change. So there's no guarantee for the effects of integrative practice, but it really helps. It adds to the probabilities that you will get things as right as you are able to do. It's all got to be seen in incremental, gradual terms, not as an instantaneous solution to anything. Now, I'm going to talk first of all then about individual practice in relation to politics. So obviously I've just been talking about individual practice in things like meditation and the arts and critical thinking. You can do all that. But specifically in relation to politics, there is a dilemma for the individual. And you could call that the dilemma between activism and quietism. So there are good arguments for being an activist and for getting involved in politics, and there are also good arguments for avoiding it. So let's look at those arguments and weigh them up. Is it really better for you as an individual to get involved in politics? So the arguments for activism, first of all, the activist case. Well, political action has the great advantage that it involves facing up to our responsibility. We can't turn our backs on things like climate change, especially things which are urgently going to affect us and everybody else. So we may feel a very strong moral responsibility to be activist, but we also need to think about the best way to fulfill that responsibility. Is it necessarily the most responsible thing to jump in, given who you are and what situation you're in? Another argument for activism is obviously the massive importance and urgency of political issues. Obviously exactly how urgent they are may depend on what country you're living in, what the time is, what events are going on. So maybe there's a case for activism at one point that there may not be at another. And that really depends on a third point, which is that we may be able to apply our abilities to make a political difference. And if you can clearly see your way to doing that, if you have the kind of personal abilities to make a difference, then there's a strong argument for going for it. Can you persuade others? Are you articulate? Are you balanced? Are you clear about what your motives are? Do you have lots of energy? Are you able to relate to different people? There are lots of different skills involved that help people to make a difference in the political arena. The socio-political environment also shapes our character and our potential for integration. So there's an argument also that you can't really just turn your back on the political realm and expect it to go away, because it will continue to shape you regardless. You are the product of your time and your place and your political environment. If you don't believe that, think about what it's like to be brought up in a democracy. Now, I'm assuming most of the people who will listen to this are living in a democracy, but some of you may not be. If you're not, that will also have had an effect on you. So I'm lucky enough to live in what is generally regarded as a liberal democracy, the UK. And I don't think I'd be sitting here saying this if that wasn't the case. If I hadn't been shaped by the freedoms that everybody in the UK takes for granted to express their political views and in that way to develop their characters, develop their potential and their views, and to justify them. Then also, if you are the kind of person who will engage in integrative practice, you are more likely to become a relatively integrated person. So a fifth argument for activism is that if you, as a relatively integrated person, don't do it, then it will be left to those who are not so integrated, and you're not going to have to look very far in the political realm to find lots of people who are extremely unintegrated. People who are dogmatic, narcissistic. I don't need to name names of well-known politicians for some to immediately spring to mind, I'm sure. So if you think that the people in the politicians in your country are making a mess of things, and they probably are, then there's a good argument for you trying to make a difference, because you're probably in a better position to make a difference. It's often said that for things to go wrong, it only takes good people to do nothing. It doesn't require necessarily anything particularly evil to happen. So there is a point there in favour of activism, that we have a responsibility to act. But before we run too hastily into activist commitment, let's also think about the Quietist case, because there are arguments for being a lot more cautious about involvement with politics. And again, the strength of these will depend on your exact situation. So the Quietist case, the stresses of political activity can be very great, and they may well disrupt the process of your individual integration. For some people, that stress is likely to be too great and too disruptive. Even if it isn't, even if you don't fall apart under the stress of political activity, then you may well be less integrated than you would be otherwise if you're not extremely well prepared for that activity. Particularly if you take a prominent role, if you take public office. Think of all the stuff that's flying at politicians day in, day out. How difficult perhaps you might find it if somebody has a go at you on social media. I don't find that at all easy. But politicians get real abuse on social media. They get arguments with opponents where they're personally attacked all the time. And of course there's the effort and the hours, the smiling face you have to present even when you're not feeling up to it. All of these are stresses, serious stressors. You need to be ready for that if you're going to get involved. Then there's also the point that we have nothing to give if we spend ourselves. So if we are going to engage in political activity with the aim of improving the world, we do have to be able to fix ourselves as well. It needs a real clear look at how well we are able to do so. The phenomenon of burnout is well known among well motivated moral politicians or social workers or other people who work with the wider public in the social realm. And then a third point for quietism is that our character may not be such as to be able to make much difference. So my personal approach to this is very much on the lines that character does make a difference. So I've decided that the best way I can contribute to politics is through intellectual commentary, through working primarily as a philosopher and a practitioner, more at an individual level. I don't think I'd be any great shakes as a politician. So that's just comes from looking at my own character and what my strengths and weaknesses are. That's not necessarily at all a recipe for you, because your character will be different. But there's a quietist case there. If your character is not such that being involved in politics is likely to be a good idea. Now, it's not just a question of yes or no, being involved in politics or not. Because, of course, there are different levels and different kinds of political activity. And those form a spectrum all the way from the most basic duties of a citizen, like voting, for example, right through up to standing for office or taking other kind of leadership role, even at a national or international level. In between that, of course, there's above simply voting every few years, there's intellectual engagement, there's keeping up, having some kind of understanding of current events. There's some kinds of activity which don't require a lot of effort or time, like so-called collectivism, signing online petitions. Obviously, you can be derogatory about that. You can say, well, people who are collectivists can't be bothered to do anything more, but maybe they've made a clear decision that it's not such a good idea to do much more, but they can do that. So why discourage them? Beyond that, there's a lot of humdrum campaigning. There's leaflet pushing and turning up to meetings and taking minutes and lots of other stuff that goes on in political activity. If you're up to that, if you're into that, then you could probably be a lot of help to other people if you're prepared to do that sort of thing. And then the standing for office, which could be at a very local level. So in the UK, for example, you could join your parish council, and that might be enough of a political challenge for many people. So the answer, the balance to be struck between the activist and the quietist case, obviously depends on taking a good hard look at ourselves, but trying to engage as much as is feasible for our level. And the various questions we could ask ourselves, whatever it is we have decided. So have we tried to retain a sense of responsibility rather than dismissing any options? Because dismissal, not thinking about it, is a pretty good sign that you're adopting an absolute view of it, and that you haven't considered things or taken responsibility for things that may be important. Have you really taken yourself into account? So some people rush into things because they feel strongly about the suffering of others, for example, or the suffering of the planet, but they haven't really thought about how they themselves should be and how they should develop. And if you don't do that, actually you are far less effective in what you do for others. But on the flip side, of course, there are also people who do take themselves into account, but don't really take the wider socio-political situation into account, and that's also part of what you need to consider. So, yes, there are particularly urgent issues at the moment. So there's climate change throughout the world. In the UK, there's Brexit and everything associated with that at the moment. And a fourth question you could ask, have you tried to apply individual practice in the context of politics? So is there some kind of attempt to unite what you do at an individual level with how you approach politics. If they're completely separated, if you think that you take your head off and put a new one on when you go to a political meeting, then that's probably not a good sign. You need there to be a sense of continuity between the two. So if you do decide to get involved in politics, particularly at the more involved levels, it is really important to try to maintain an individual practice in that context. So meditation is probably a really good way, really necessary to control stress and to moderate polarisation in your interactions in the political realm. The arts are probably really necessary as well to maintain openness to new possibilities. Now, you may not feel you always have time for those things, but you can do them in relatively brief ways. And there are alternatives. So if meditation is too demanding, try some sort of physical discipline or just going for a walk. All these things can help. If you can't gather the creativity to do something artistic, at least listen to some music. But then, probably the most important level of individual practice in the context of politics is critical thinking. And the application of critical thinking is vital to doing political discussion well. If you listen to political discussion as it goes on, particularly in the media, in Parliament, in public discussion generally, the level is pretty low, at least in the UK, and I think in many other countries as well. I say it's very low because there are all kinds of very obvious fallacies going on which go unchallenged, overwhelmingly unchallenged. So it's not just that, for example, people get away with ad hominems and straw men and single cause fallacies, things of that kind in the context of politics all the time. It's that there's no real expectation that it will be otherwise. And even political journalists either don't seem to be aware or don't seem to think it's important, usually, to challenge those sorts of things in discussion. In order to improve our political life, one of the vital things, in my view, is to enable critical thinking to become an expectation in that political life. To do that, obviously, there needs to be much, much more effective education in critical thinking. Without that education, people may have good intentions, but they may not have the skills that they need to actually think critically and to spot fallacious and highly biased thinking and arguing. But yeah, it's also needs to be introduced at a political level, to introduce a political expectation that can actually raise the level of debate and the level of decision making. So it's not much good expecting things to improve on social media if the example set by people in national politics, for example, is so low. Let me move on then from individual practice of integration in relation to politics to integration at a socio-political level. So here we get into a slightly more complex area, because it's one thing to understand how we could become more integrated at an individual level. We can resolve the conflicts we have within ourselves and become more consistent in our thinking. It's another to try and apply that model at the level of a group, of any group, let alone something as complex as a government or a political party or anything of that kind. But we have to try, I think, because it's very clear to me that the same factors apply. So if we want to try and judge what makes a better government, which makes better judgments, the major thing has got to be surely that it is an integrated government which means that although people will have different views, those views are encountered in a way that allows us to learn from those differences and to reconcile those differences, rather than ending up with intransigent polarization and conflict. As we probably know from too many examples, conflictual government and conflictual groups are ineffectual. They're paralysed in the end by their conflict. So the way in which we can judge the integration of a government in comparison to an individual depends on the integration of various elements in that government. So most obviously, perhaps you can think of the individuals who lead the government. So in the UK at the moment, I don't know how much longer, we have Theresa May, who is still Prime Minister as I speak, but may not be for much longer. In the UK, in the US, you have Donald Trump, and so on. Now, these people are obviously not very integrated, particularly Donald Trump, and that affects the government. The effects on the government are obvious to any informed observer. So yes, it is important for people in positions of power to be as integrated as possible, but that's not the whole thing. We can't just reduce the government to one powerful person. That person works with other people who influence them, obviously the people in their cabinet, the people high up in their government. They need to be working together as well as relatively integrated as individuals. Then there's integration between different branches of government. So between the executive, the legislature or parliament, and the judiciary. If those three branches of government are pulling in opposite directions, you get ineffectual government. And again, we can see that at the moment in both the US and the UK, where the executive, the government as such, is in conflict with the Parliament or the Congress. But then there's also the integration of the government with the people. So democracy is the chief thing which enables government to be integrated with people. If the government pursues policies which are in conflict with what the people wish, then that's going to lead to difficulties down the line. You can't simply impose policies on people that they don't accept, because if you do, they're going to be poorly implemented because there'll be a lot of alienation and resistance to those policies. If you do it with the people's support, it's far, far more likely to be effective. So if for no other reason, democracy is important, and is even better if it's liberal democracy, that is, democracy where human rights are respected and where there's freedom of speech, so that people can raise their issues and they are discussed. Then there's the integration of government with other governments. So international organisations are vital to that. International integration. And in terms of the people themselves in society at large, the integration of groups within society is also vital for political integration. So if there are different groups at odds with each other in society, for example, two different ethnic groups in conflict with each other, think of the Serbs and the Croats, say, then you're very likely to have less effective conflicted government as well. So all these different aspects of government contribute in a complex way to how integrated the government is. But it's the fact that it's so complex means we have to work politically in lots of different potential ways. So you can help government become more integrated by electing better office holders, by being consistent in who you elect to different branches of government, by supporting democracy, or helping to make democracy more effective in the way it represents people's wishes, or finds a balance between those wishes and effective policy, and by supporting international organisations. So, if you think about an issue like climate change today, international organisations are vital. International governance is vital for addressing a global problem like that. If you undermine international organisations like the EU and the UN, then the ways in which those problems are addressed is likely to be far, far less effective. So when we use our political influence, such as it is, the way in which we use it, I think, needs to recognise that a political goal is the integration of government. This isn't a question of what ideology you adopt. It is a question of how you interpret that ideology, and whether you interpret that ideology in a way that helps government to become more integrated, whether it's a conservative or liberal or a socialist government. So all these different kinds of integrations in government make it more likely that that government will address conditions, because differing concerns and needs of those different elements in society and in government will be taken into account and not repressed. So if you contrast democratic government with totalitarian government, the thing that stands out is obviously repression, and that repression makes the totalitarian government far less effective in the long term at addressing conditions. Resentments build up, mistakes are made, perhaps bold policies are taken which are not properly thought through, and they involve alienation and repression, which later come back to haunt the people who do that. So Nazi Germany might have seemed effective for a while, but we know what happened. There's a terrible fragility in that incredibly unintegrated form of government. And it may seem that the opposing kind of the approach of trying to integrate government is a bit wet or a bit soft. A lot of people may want bold government, and sometimes it is necessary to have bold government. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should adopt forms of government or policies which prevent governments from being bold and from making tough decisions. It's not, the middle way is not simply a matter of compromise. Compromise is obviously central to government, so you can't run government or indeed be involved in politics without being able to compromise. But that doesn't imply that the most effective position is conventionally centrist and compromising. Sometimes there are urgent conditions that need addressing, and political leadership involves really getting stuck into that condition, recognising it and communicating it strongly and making something happen. And that's obviously what needs to happen with climate change. So, how is political integration brought about? What can we do to support it? I'm just going to run through a few broad kinds of strategies, things that I think we should support politically in order to support political integration. So, for one thing, democracies work on the basis of constitutions. They have established constitutional arrangements, whether they're written, as in the US, or unwritten, as in the UK. On the whole, I think we need to work within those constitutional arrangements, as long as they're not totally dysfunctional. If if they're working reasonably well, then they are supported and reinforced by our participation in them and our respect for them. But of course there can be situations where those arrangements break down. There's effective liberal democracy, which does mean that we need to support the basic institution of democracy and of freedom of speech. But of course there are tricky judgments to be made in that whole area, like the use of referendums. It's come to the fore recently in the UK, where people may be democratically making a decision which they are very ill informed about. Then there's the whole question of what freedom of speech means when a lot of major newspapers or TV channels are owned by large corporations with strong interests. So you can appeal to freedom of speech, but actually freedom of speech may be undermined by those very organs that are supposed to be promoting it. So there's a tension there and a difficulty to be navigated. But generally speaking, somehow or other we need to support liberal democracy and work out for ourselves really what is the best way of doing that. Then there's the importance of deliberative elements in democracy. So this is really quite an undeveloped area, I think, that in order to be able to judge effectively, we need to be able to think critically about our beliefs. Now, some of that might be addressed by more effective critical thinking education and political education, but we really can't wait for a new generation to be brought up with that more effective education, even assuming it happens soon. Another way of working is the idea of citizens' juries. So those force people to think about an issue over a period of time, having listened to different views about it. So you take a random cross-section of the population, a kind of jury, you sit them down maybe for a few days to think about an issue and see what conclusions they reach about it. That often seems to be far, far more effective than a referendum, for example. So you are combining a voice of the people with information and deliberation. You're recognising actually people are quite weak and ill-informed on the whole, at least at the moment, so we need to do something about that before trusting them to make important decisions. So that's not undermining democracy and what it can do, it's enhancing it. We also need effective representation of different interests. So if you have a dysfunctional electoral system, as I think we do in the UK, then very often major interests are simply not represented because of the way the electoral system works, the first past the post system. So that means that a party can get 12% of the vote or something, have zero representation in Parliament. That really isn't good enough. If that happens, then the effect is very often a sense of repression and conflict which results from it. Then there's supporting international governance, which I've already mentioned, which is very important to make sure that different governments coordinate their activities. Then there's sufficient cultural convergence and tolerance in society. So where there are different cultural or ethnic groups or different religious groups in society, obviously you're not going to be able to develop a more integrated community without some convergence between them. That doesn't mean homogenization, it just means sufficient cultural convergence for them to have something in common. And where there isn't convergence, obviously tolerance for things, for unimportant differences. Then there's limitations in social and economic inequality. Equally important, if you think about the effects of gross inequality of the kind that we're increasingly getting in the world today, what that tends to mean is that the richest 1% of the population have very, very different interests to, say, the poorest 50% of the population. The greater the inequality, the greater the resentment and the conflict in society. So it is really important to try and address that, which is why, well, we shouldn't be able to move too far right. So there are people who have almost no regard at all for equality. They're right-wing extremists, generally speaking. There are people who are moderate conservatives who do care about equality, and that can be part of conservatism. So it's can be part of any mainstream ideology to care to some extent about equality in society. Then effective citizenship education. So that can happen in schools, but it can happen in all sorts of other ways. The ways in which we support each other, and this talk is a kind of education, of course. So if you have a knowledge and understanding of politics and of critical thinking, you can help people just by helping them to be informed about what's going on. There's an expectation of critical thinking in the media and amongst politicians, which I've already mentioned, and an expectation of objectivity in the media. Obviously, something like Fox News in the US is completely beyond the pale in terms of its effects, the political disintegration it causes, because its presentation of the news is so biased and limited that the people who rely on it are completely separated from a mainstream understanding of political events. Could there be almost anything worse for disintegration in society? I can't really think of anything, unless it's the echo chamber effect in social media, which also accentuates the same issues. So there are a lot of urgent issues there which require or ways of bringing about political integration. So again, rather than simply chasing a particular ideology, my suggestion is our political policies should be giving priority to these. So it's really for us as individuals to decide for ourselves how we can support political integration. Maybe from a very basic level, about who we vote for, and the basic support we offer to institutions. Just paying our taxes properly is a political action. And even if we're only engaging at an occasional intellectual level in politics, calling out irresponsible positions, trying to engage with them constructively and helpfully, of course, but not just allowing them to get away with slipshod thinking. And educating ourselves, helping to educate others, all whilst trying not to be overwhelmed. Because as things are at the moment, it will be very easy to be overwhelmed by the press of political events and sometimes the apparent hopelessness of political events. I think we can do something about it. We can engage with those political events in an appropriate and effective way by practicing the middle way.